After experimenting with many aspects of writing I could think of, from writing in third person to writing in 6 distinct styles for first person perspectives in a single novel, I've gotten to the point where I can express anything I want in writing and trust myself to write any story or any character in any style. What I want to share is how you can fully express your world and characters while making it readable to an audience. And although I will be talking about the novel format, many of the things can be applied to other mediums as well. I asked myself a lot of questions, tried multiple ways of doing the same thing, and when I couldn't find any answers online because my questions became really specific, I realized I had the answers all along. It all comes down to one thing. If you can write a single good sentence, you can write a good paragraph, scene, chapter, and book because they all follow the same structure, story structure. Story structure is important because it is the most efficient way you can teach and relay information. And the closer your sentences adopt this structure, the more memorable the story becomes. It is this feeling you get when you can just sit back and trust that the story will take you on a specific experience. To give an example of how story structure feels, I'm sure you remember a particular event in your life, such as being taught by a good teacher or even a situation where someone has done harm to you. Whether it has done good or bad for you, you remember it because everything in your life clicked at that moment and had significant impact, a climax if you will. And whether you like it or not, everyone's life is playing out a story, and story writing uses this understanding of the fundamental aspect of life in order to transmit an experience to others as accurately and precisely as possible. So to translate the process of life into writing, we call this story structure. And to give a simplified version, it consists of 3 components: a setup, a climax, and an aftermath. There are variations of this structure where more details exist between each step, but fundamentally, this is all you need to naturally draw readers forward. You don't have to make a sentence follow story structure, but it does help the reader stay engaged, which requires more effort and care on your part as a writer. Take, for example, taking a test in school. The teacher says there will be a test on a specific day and you will be studying for it. The setup will be your studying, the climax is the test, and the aftermath is whatever happens after, which could be results, talking to others about the questions, or you forgetting everything because it will be useless to you anyway. This entire story arc can be considered as a book. Now say you want to make your sentences also follow this structure. Using the same example, that means you go into your setup and create a story arc within the section. Maybe you are studying multiple subjects, so you can get more detailed about the important information being revealed to you as you study. By applying story structure this way, you'll then have a story within a story within a story. If you're mathematically inclined, you can also think of this as a fractal, how tree branches branch off into smaller and thinner portions, yet it's still connected to the idea of a tree. If you want to get even more specific, take the word setup literally. It's like setting the stage with props before people come in to mess around. When the curtains pull away and you see the stage for the first time, you are hit with a certain mood or atmosphere that the stage props attempt to convey. This is the same with a book. The setup section sets the rules of the world that the characters will play in. In between the setup and the climax, you can have the build-up section. After the rules and players have been established, the build-up utilizes the established world as the ground and canvas to trickle in secrets and revelations on something important and relevant to the characters. If the information is important but doesn't affect the character in any way, it's not a reveal. It's a setup, it's exposition, or it may be entirely unnecessary. When the information also affects the character's direction, decision-making, and perspective of the world they are in, that is considered relevant. You can reveal such information multiple times over a short period for a very nice and effective punchline on the climax, or you can do it over an extended period of time, especially if you have a large world or various emotions you're going through for your character. The type of build-up also depends on the kind of story you want to write, the plot and character arcs you have, and your writing style. And when the climax comes, it is the final thing that changes the character's and reader's mind about the world. Note that build-ups can be used for emotional stories to tether the reader to a certain emotion before moving on to the next emotion in quick succession. If you're writing a plot-driven story or a story that involves surprise and shock with information, it doesn't necessarily need a build-up, just a well-executed setup and punchline. Also, remember that readers are following your character's journey on the page, not the journey in your head as a writer. So whatever you put on the page is the only thing they will know. I've seen stories where the author thinks they are revealing important information, but they haven't set up the direction of the story, nor do they build anything up, which leads to a dry and unexciting climax. The effect this will have is similar to saying the sky is blue. To a reader, it will seem like a fact in the world rather than an important revelation. If there is no setup in the story, then there's also no established direction for the reader to understand, and the climax won't hit no matter what because the rules haven't been established. Other times, you may write a proper setup and direction, but the climax still doesn't hit when the revelation occurs. This is due to the revealed information being too one-dimensional, a result of being too scared to change the rules so much because you don't know if you can handle it, or you may have not developed your world or character enough. Fix this by introducing more nuances into your world and also understand that once the climax hits and a larger perspective is revealed, it's like going to a larger playground with more unique things to play with. Before the climax, your world is a small circle and the reader's perspective slowly expands from the center, gradually learning what kind of world your character is living in. Once they understand everything inside the circle, the setup is complete and the build-up begins. The character ventures out of their comfort zone, discovers things they haven't seen before, and the reader also learns about these new things alongside the character. As the character discovers more and more, dots begin to connect until the final important piece of information comes, shakes the worldview of the character, and expands the world of what is possible. You are adding information on top of the information you already have, not creating a whole new circle and jumping to it. You can add a completely new circle, but that involves crafting a whole new culture or world, which is out of the scope of what I'll be covering. So after the climax hits, you then have the aftermath, which is what the characters do with the information that has been revealed to them. What actions do they take, and are they able to navigate the world knowing this new information? Then this can lead to another setup, climax, and aftermath, which repeats again and again. It is a constant reveal of information and application before the next challenge comes. Now, with the understanding of the cycles of story structure, you can create 3 types of stories: positive, negative, and stagnant. Note that this isn't a judgment of what a story is, rather it's a description. A positive story is what everyone is familiar with, the monomyth or the hero's journey where there's a happy ending. A negative story, also called a tragedy, is where the ending is not favorable to the character or even the audience. For a stagnant story, the characters never learn anything even after a climax. But at that point, there isn't really a point in writing this type of story anyway. It almost doesn't follow story structure because the character isn't affected by anything. It will appear as if the information is just revealed sporadically, or the buildup is so drawn out that you can barely perceive any changes. Note that if you do write stagnant stories, to readers, it will feel like reading a textbook or a manual, which is also why those things are a chore to read. But if you find it fun writing this way, then do it, because fun is the only thing that matters. As for tragedies, they are rarely done well because a well-written tragedy is one where the best decision will always lead a character to the worst outcome in the context of the story. Most tragedies are done where characters are obviously making foolish decisions rather than the best decisions, which becomes comical because there really isn't a setup that makes their choices impactful. Especially for a tragedy, the rules need to be set up properly in the beginning and not betrayed. Stupid and foolish characters happen when you do not want to lean into the character and make them too smart. And when you think this way as a writer, it's usually because your character lacks characterization and a solid personality. This applies not just to tragedy but for all stories. A tragedy only makes a lack of characterization more apparent because writing skill is put up front for readers to see. Note that it doesn't matter what type of story you write, positive or negative, as it will always need to follow story structure in order for there to be any genuine effect on the audience. There is always a setup, climax, and aftermath, and it is only the aftermath of the reveal that classifies the part of the story as positive, negative, or stagnant. On the scale of readability, not following story structure makes a story less readable and less effective because the climax is heavily dependent on trigger words rather than skill to provide shock or emotion, which I will talk more about in the pacing section. If you follow story structure perfectly, however, the story will be readable, understandable, and memorable to the maximum amount of people. Theoretically, if a reader picks up the perfect kind of story, they will understand everything and memorize everything from their own perspective. A story that follows story structure also means the writer is good at teaching and communicating because they play two roles simultaneously: to understand the reader's perspective and to introduce new information as the teacher of the story, which ties into pacing. To understand pacing, we can take a look at what bad pacing is. A lot of readers and writers say the pacing is either too fast or too slow, but this statement assumes that pacing is based on time when it is in fact based on information. Even for stories in songs, plays, and shows where there is a timed aspect to it, time doesn't play a role in making the audience's experience fast or slow because the media runs at the same speed for everyone who watches or listens. So if time doesn't matter, how can you understand pacing when you only have text? We all understand that when you hold a book, all the text is already there, but you don't know what happens because the information hasn't passed through your eyes yet. Similarly, someone acting on stage already has the whole script memorized, but they understand the audience needs to see it unfold in time. What unfolds here is information. You watch an actor say their lines one by one, and when you read, you absorb the words and sentences line by line. When information is skipped, you say it's too fast, but it's more accurate to say you don't understand the logical connection between two pieces of information. To you as a reader, it feels as if you've read step 1 and then step 7. Sometimes it's the writer's fault for not adding in extra information to fill in those gaps, and it's their job to find a balance between what they understand and what the audience understands, and be fine with some people not understanding everything. Then there's the case where you may say the pacing is too slow, but it's more accurate to say that the same information is being repeated or there's a lot of irrelevant filler between important pieces of information. In other words, can the writer move on because there's nothing new and it doesn't change your mood or understanding of the situation? Take, for example, the idiom of beating a dead horse. The purpose of beating a horse is to kill it, but once the horse is killed, why continue to beat it? It's the same motion, it's the same action, it's the same intention. It's a cool effect if you want to use repetition as an effect, but if the same words are used on paper, you'll skim to save time by reading the only word that's different. You may think it's a fun tool to use as a writer, but you need to connect the idea of what is cool and awesome in your head to how the reader's eyes move across a page. There are an infinite number of techniques you can use, but always make sure that's how a reader sees it. The best way is to understand that a reader goes through a book line by line in reading order. Every reader has a different reading speed, and although it may relate to how fast they process information, it's not always the case. Sometimes as a writer, you can force a reader to read faster or slower by intentionally writing a lot of useless sentences that has nothing to do with the story in order to make readers skim everything. Or you can make your sentences structurally unreadable to force them to read closely, but neither of these serve a purpose. Doing this is a very superficial way of forcing someone to waste their time, and a lot of stories do this in all mediums. This type of artificial difficulty in reading arises when you don't understand what you are writing about, and when you want to recite moral or philosophical jargon you've heard from elsewhere. To an intelligent reader, it feels as if you have some kind of agenda you want to shove down their throat. To avoid doing this, just don't write or talk about things you have not experienced or have no idea about, because the execution will come off as disingenuous and profane. It will also be obvious to someone like myself if a writer is writing about something they don't know about because the writing style, word choice, and story structure elements are different compared to people who really care about getting a message across. Another thing is you don't need to force yourself to be deep. Have fun and write about things you genuinely care for because that's when you naturally write in story structure. Doing so also makes all the steps of the story fall into place and your messages won't feel forced. And as someone who enjoys raw and unfiltered emotion in writing, I guarantee you I will appreciate that over you trying hard to be deep, and so will anyone else. So to affect reading speed with meaningful and intentional writing, we'll have to look at information density. The more information you can provide in a single phrase or sentence, the slower someone will read because they will need time to process everything. To put it another way, take for example watching a video at twice the normal speed. Some people can process information faster while others cannot. What happens in 1 second for some, others will have 2 seconds of information or more. Now, what if you want to convey a lot of information in a single sentence while keeping people's processing speeds high? This requires more skill because you will need to condense information into a few words and pack it with meaning, all while making it simple and easy to read. Writing this way also doesn't guarantee that readers will understand, so it's all about balancing what you want to write explicitly and what you want to imply, depending on your preferences. Combining everything, the precise definition of pacing is the density of relevant information the audience absorbs in linear sequential order. Sometimes a lot of information is presented in a sentence, while other times they are spread out. As a writer, you generally want to have the same pacing throughout your story. It's like the beats per minute of a song. You can also change the pacing of the story to make it feel like the character is evolving, but it's dependent on whether you know what you're doing or not. It also varies between each writer because faster pacing requires skill to keep consistency, while slower pacing is good for beginners and people who want to write reasonably well without having to think or edit so much. For example, if you're writing an action book as a beginner, it may take you 3,000 words or about 10 pages to get from one important point to the next, while world building, character building, plot building, and so on. Then, when an action scene comes and two characters are fighting, you may make an important point every 1,000 words. And if you really want your climax to hit, you start making many important reveals like once every 500 words. The reason you want to default to a larger number of words like 3,000 between each important point is because if you want to ramp up something, then you really need that word cushion so that you don't have to exert yourself to condense all plot elements into a poetic 10-word sentence. The same applies to people who want to write good enough but have deadlines. 3,000 words between each important point is just an example. You really need to write something first in order to find out what you are comfortable with on your own. For more skilled writers, it may take 500 to 1,000 words to write an entire story arc, and sometimes they may make a single word have so much impact to the point you feel so much emotion. But I've mostly seen these in other mediums like anime, shows, and movies. And theoretically speaking, such writers can pack an action sequence with the same impact a beginner writer would have in 500 words into a single 10-word sentence. Generally, all readers can understand slower-paced stories and it will be readable to them, but more attentive readers may stop reading because it's too slow. I am one of these people, and my reason for it is because I read slow, so if there's nothing relevant happening in 1,000 words, I stop reading. It's mainly a preference of how I choose to invest my time, but if the premise is good and the writing has a vision, then anyone including myself would stick around even if the pacing is slow. As for the readability of faster-paced stories, you may get readers who can't understand what you are writing about. In fact, these types of stories are generally less read than slower-paced ones because it takes a significant amount of reading skill to read someone who has good writing skills. Usually this is because writers need to use a wide variety of vocabulary to make a point concise, or if the writing is simple, then the readers may not understand subtext. If you want your readers to still be able to read your story without subtext, then you will need to consider the different layers of information that exists. I have found that there's a maximum of 3 layers of information you can glean from a sentence or any work of art: intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. The intellectual layer of information is the surface level of what a reader sees, the explicit words and sentences that are taken at face value. A lot of books are written this way and a lot of readers read this way. There's not much to say about its benefits other than being the simplest way to read and write. Here, the writer mostly relies on trigger words to get you to feel emotion rather than their own skill as a writer, which is why I put the emotional layer as its own category. An example of a trigger word in a story would be declaring someone as dead in the first sentence. To someone who puts death on a pedestal and as something extremely tragic in the grand scheme of life, they might feel something. The equivalent of this in daily life is you can go outside or talk to people online and trigger them just by saying one word. But for any attentive reader who sees words as tools to communicate ideas, it will take more convincing because it appears as a lack of effort from the writer to gain sympathy points. There is no grace, subtlety, or skill in using the word die or dead because anyone can use it. If a reader can't trust the writer's word choices in the first sentence, then how can they trust the rest of the work when such words are thrown around with no weight behind them? As a writer, display your skill up front and keep it consistent throughout the rest of the story. Other trigger words can be anything pertaining to social norms, what is bad and evil according to morals and ethics, almost every spicy scene in the romance genre, statements of atrocities and gore in the grimdark genre, or destroyer of worlds in a lot of fantasy and isekai genres in attempt to tell readers that an entity is larger than life. Yes, these words may be shocking or epic the first time around, but starting a book with these words without establishing the background for it won't have any effect. You may also call trigger words overused words, which mostly happens when you do not have a vision for your story. If you truly have a story you want to tell and you want readers to also experience the same things you feel, you will do anything in your power to make sure they will feel that way and you won't resort to carelessness of word choice. And once you care about the story you want to tell, it will be inevitable for the emotional layer of information to be unlocked. The emotional layer is rarely used, and even if it is, it's rarely done well. This is because if you truly want to convey emotion, you purely show and don't tell at all. Instead of outright saying someone is sad, angry, or happy, you write about their thoughts, body language, reaction towards their environment, or the words they choose in their dialogue. And if you truly let your creativity shine, you can convey emotion even when your characters look at dirt. By infusing emotion into how the character perceives the world, you sort of force the reader to piece together what the characters are feeling from context clues. There are many ways to go about it, and what I mentioned mostly works with first-person perspectives. For writing emotion in any perspective, you need to know what mood you want to convey first, and subtly guide the reader into a corner so that it is inevitable that they will come to understand the emotion being shown. Your words kind of creates a tunnel or guide rails that leads to a precise and specific emotion. It's like leading the reader along a path by using a narrow range of words, and the further they progress along the path, the higher the probability they will conclude correctly what emotion the character is feeling. Carefully sprinkle the vocabulary throughout the text, and that's how atmosphere is created. When done well, a single paragraph can generate momentum, contain a setup and climax, and can continue building into the next paragraph. And when you want the emotion to stop, you can resolve it whenever you need to. Emotion is challenging to get right because unlike film and comics and anime and manga, you don't have assistance of music or shapes and colors to do the heavy lifting of creating atmosphere. With pure writing alone, the only way you can immerse readers is to leave subtle yet sufficient detail in your word choice so that they don't forget the state of the character. And if you want to make sure people who don't understand subtext can follow along, you'll need to do the extra work to make the intellectual layer of information logical while keeping the integrity of the subtext. You also need to know exactly and precisely how you want to portray a scene, which can get to the point where even a single misplaced word will dissolve the momentum of the emotion. Then you have the spiritual layer of information, which touches deep into the universal human experience. Most of this type of information is found in autobiographies and diaries, while fantastical stories that touch upon these will be in scriptures, fables, myths, and legends. However, this type of information is also the most misinterpreted and tampered with to the point it loses most of its original meaning. The nature of this layer of information is that it can make sense beyond the original context due to its universal and timeless nature. This is the epitome of what the best writing can give you: wisdom. You may have heard of double entendres, which are words, phrases, and sentences with double meanings. You mostly hear this in lyrics of songs and rap, and you can also have triple or quadruple entendres and more. Wisdom, for instance, can be considered an infinite entendre with multifaceted meanings. Sentences written with such clarity can make each person reading it receive a variety of meanings, and if they return to the sentence a day, a week, or months later, they may take something entirely different from the same sentence based on their mood. Not everyone can write this way because not everyone has enormous amounts of life experience with the capability of seeing multiple perspectives without judgment. This doesn't mean you need to be old, and in fact, age doesn't matter in terms of wisdom. Someone old can have significantly less life experience than a child who has been severely traumatized, for example. Wisdom from life experience also doesn't mean you've tried a lot of things, it means you've experienced a lot of transformations and you're able to remain sane afterwards. And for people living normal lives, you're lucky if you manage to reach into this layer of information. The closest you can get without experiencing a lot of life is by having a deep sense of empathy and compassion to see and write multiple perspectives simultaneously. But even then, the words will likely not have the same resolution and nuance as people with first-hand experience, so majority of people can ignore this layer. What a lot of writers forget about when writing a story is that there's intellectual and emotional momentum on the reader's end. This can be seen when the writer begins to build up to a climax, but the momentum never pays off and flatlines with a cop-out or a complete shift in tone, rendering the setup completely pointless. In some cases, the writer felt the need to force an outcome to their own desires when the situation and context didn't call for it, which happens when details are forgotten, when the writer doesn't know how their words intellectually or emotionally impact the reader, or when there's a desire to force an agenda. Intellectual momentum is the easiest to keep track of because it's created by distinct facts that you can count. These are usually explicit hints that the reader will know about because you as a writer told them that this piece of information is important in the story. These usually come as plot points, facts about the world, capabilities of characters, or a big reveal and plot twist that pays off the expectations you set for the reader. The way to kill intellectual momentum is by completely disregarding the established logic of the world after many pages of planning, also called deus ex machina or plot armor for any character. Essentially, you've wasted the reader's time by saying all the information that they've read up until that point was in fact useless and they didn't need to read all those pages. To avoid this, you need to be willing to play by the laws of your universe or the personalities of the characters you've created. If you're uncomfortable with either, then expand or contract the world or personality to the point which you can handle. Then there's emotional momentum, which has killed a lot of stories because of a lack of understanding of how a reader's mind works. This happens a lot in perspective-changing stories where one character may be hateful and then the next chapter starts with a character being oblivious. This can also happen in single perspective stories and even between scenes or at climaxes. If you want to establish and perpetuate emotional momentum, you need to choose the right words and make sure the sentence feels exactly as you imagined it to be without any compromise. Knowing when and where to end the emotion is also important if you don't want it to leak into the next scene or chapter. You can do this in many ways, but the idea is that you want a cushion of words towards the end to absorb the momentum so that the scene or chapter has a definitive stop. There isn't a definitive way to do this, and everyone has their own style and story, so you'll need to experiment with it yourself. To kill emotional momentum, you can make jokes when the situation is supposed to be serious or throw in another emotion that is unrelated to how the scene is supposed to be portrayed. A fix to this has to do with consistency. If you're writing an emotional scene over several days, weeks, or months, then you really need to have a good grasp of your emotion to be able to switch it on and off, like method acting. Another way to think about writing emotionally is that every word you add affects the emotion of your sentence, enhances it, dampens it, or keeps it neutral. Use words that enhance the emotion or those that keeps it neutral. I can go on for hours about emotional writing, but that's a separate topic on its own. Another thing to note is that these two types of momentum affect the rereadability of your story. If your story is plot-driven, which in most cases is purely intellectual momentum, then your story will be less rereadable because your story depends on informational reveals and twists. At the end of your story, the reader will know everything about the twists, making it a chore to read the build-up again when the emotions of shock and surprise hinges on trigger words. If you want to make your story rereadable and consistent in how it makes readers feel, then you will need to infuse emotional momentum into it. It does take more skill to write, but it's doable by understanding story structure and knowing where to place words and sentences in the right places. Also, there's no such thing as spiritual momentum because the information serves as a punchline. This type of information is also already in our human experience, it just needs to be revealed. Once a universal experience is revealed, then readers will just know it and keep it for the rest of their lives. Then we have punctuation. Many writers who tell you to read in order to learn how to write don't give you any specifics as to what reading actually helps you with, because they very likely copy what others say and haven't explored the extent of their own writing or how their mind works. I'm going to say right now that the only thing reading is good for is to understand how to read punctuation. That's it. Other than that, reading can potentially help with understanding your writing preferences because how you like to read is also how you like to write, or at least that's the case for me. But even then, if that's not the case, using myself as an example, I can't find anyone who writes the way I want to read, so I began writing in my own style without referring to other books. If you're the same way and find a lot of books not your thing, it's likely you read and write differently and you can contribute your unique perspective and style. You can also watch shows, listen to how people teach, or listen to friends speak in order to understand the differences in the play of language and apply that to your own writing. The only technical thing that prevents most people from writing exactly how they feel is punctuation. What punctuation does is take how we separate information in our speech and mimic it in writing. If we write without any punctuation, readers get lost, and it will make it unnecessarily challenging to find when an idea is complete. So having that visual guide makes reading easier. There are only 12 different kinds of punctuation you need to know: the comma and period, the colon and semicolon, the n and m dashes and the hyphen, the apostrophe and quotation mark, the question mark and exclamation mark, and the ellipses. Beginners can stick to commas and periods because they are sufficient to get most points across, then slowly add hyphens, semicolons, and m dashes to increase sentence variation and present more complex ideas. Other things like brackets can be used at your leisure, but the 12 I've mentioned can help convey basically everything you want to convey in the English language. Brackets and parentheses in English aren't implemented often, and even if they are, the purpose of it is usually ambiguous, meaning you as a reader don't even know why it's being used, and in most cases, it doesn't enhance your reading or provide a unique effect. There are other novels that use brackets because they are in the literary RPG genre, and maybe some authors use parentheses to add footnotes within a sentence. But I won't be talking about those, and will stick to traditional storytelling with words and the 12 punctuation marks. Sometimes you can combine them to make it look like someone is stuttering or crying, or you can combine the question and exclamation mark into an interrobang. Also, for n and m dashes, they both serve the same function and can be interchangeable. N dashes are mostly used for British writing, while m dashes are mainly American writing. I don't know about Australians, and it doesn't really matter that much anyway. If you do decide to use both n and m dashes, just keep it consistent in your writing and interested readers won't care. I won't be going over how to use them because there are many free resources to help you understand what they do. There are many videos on punctuation, especially videos teaching English to English learners, that you can go through and learn everything in an hour or less. The most important thing you need to remember about punctuation is how each of them reads. Read a sentence out loud and feel each punctuation. You can also listen to how people speak and practice writing punctuation by translating their words into text. If all else fails and you just can't understand it, you can get an editor. Now that I've covered everything you basically need as a beginner, how do you actually choose a story to write? This mostly comes from your own ideas and interests. All stories need a climax, so that's usually where your stories pivot off of, which makes it easy to plan or improvise the world and characters before and after that point. Your first chapter or first few pages are also important, and you may want a climax within it. I've seen novels where it takes 2 or more chapters to set up the characters and world, which is alright if you can't condense everything into a single chapter, but I would suggest doing so, especially if you want to respect the reader's time. If you are a beginner and don't know how to start, having a climax in the beginning to set your world and character's personality helps a lot with setting the direction of future chapters. The reason for this is because of something called the inciting incident, the event that forces your character to deal with something in front of them and sends them on a journey. It doesn't need to be a supernatural or fantastical event. It could be something another character reveals, or it can be an emotion. You can use anything as the climax, even something simple like rain. When you set something like rain as the climax, now you have to think, what makes rain interesting? Maybe I'm writing about another planet, a post-apocalyptic world, a desert. Maybe it's a culture that worships rain. Maybe it's the character's first time outside after being locked in darkness. You can come up with so many scenarios to make rain or any climax interesting. This is the beauty of storytelling. You can make anything significant as long as you execute it well. So choose. Choose what you want to make significant and write your story. I'm editing and I forgot one very important thing you need to know as a story writer. Always, always, always put the important information on the climax, even for the mini climaxes throughout your story. This applies to every genre. You might say, well, that doesn't apply to mystery because you need red herrings to throw readers off with fake information. This is good only if your intent is to make the reader read a bunch of useless information. If you have the writing skill, you can make even false information feel too real and coincidental at the climax. The point is, you can have multiple pieces of false information and they all make sense, as long as you build it up with proper execution. This also means you need to know more nuances about your world and characters because you need more detail. If the information is important to your world, put it at the climax. If it's important to the characters, put it at the climax. If it's important to the plot, put it at the climax. If it's important to the reader, put it at the climax. That way, you don't ask yourself why readers don't remember things when you wrote everything explicitly. It's because you wrote it so that they won't remember it. I don't know why a lot of writers, even professional writers, do this. It shows a lack of understanding of story structure. This also applies to pacing. To define pacing another way, it's about the information or image you get as a reader when you finish reading an idea. Sentences, phrases, and words need to be packaged in a way to encapsulate that idea. If you want a particular thought or image to be remembered by the reader, that phrase or sentence also needs to be put at the climax. And remember, stories are fractals. There are climaxes, even mini climaxes, spread throughout the entire story.